Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another episode review from the classic 90s Goosebumps television show that aired on Fox Kids. This episode comes from Season 2. It was directed by Randy Bradshaw and written by Charles Laser. And the episode in question is The Scarecrow Walks at Midnight. I remember watching this episode on Cartoon Network days, more so than I did on like Fox Family reruns or even on Fox Kids back in the day. And I'm sure I did watch it beforehand, but I remember when I was around the age of 12 or 13 watching this episode in quite a while, that this was one of the better episodes from the show. And for a long time, this was probably in my top 10 until I got to really watch everything all the way through. But after going, reading the book and then watching the episode in succession, I do think that this episode takes some valiant swings to try to improve on some things that might have been an issue in the book for me. Then on the other hand, because this is a 21-minute adaptation, and because I have more sentimental connection with the book, I feel like those sentimental bonus points I gave to the book in my review of it aren't going to be reflected here. It's not as good as I remembered it, if I'm being honest, but it still is one of the creepier Goosebumps episodes in the show. And it is a Charles Laser episode after all. And if you don't know Charles Laser, he likes to take stories and completely change them up. And most of the time it works. And I think it does work here. And this kind of offers a more scarier product. But that's with its give and takes, though. And I'll save a lot of what I want to say about that in the book versus episode video after this. But in a nutshell, do I recommend the Scarecrow Walks at Midnight episode? Absolutely. If you have not watched this episode, maybe you haven't seen the TV show in a long time, maybe you have never watched an episode of the television show, this would be a perfect episode to jump into right now. It will get you right in that fall atmosphere, late summer, summerween time frame of year. It's pretty well made, and I think most people would get some enjoyment out of it. But without further ado, let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So the story starts off with a cutaway of this truck driving down this farmland, and it's revealed that these two kids are in the back of the truck named Jody and Mark, and the driver is named Stanley, who is this farmhand on this farm owned by Jody and Mark's grandparents. And the grandparents are so elated to see them. Jody, in the episode, looks considerably older than her younger brother Mark. In the book, I think she was 12 and Mark was 11. But here, it looks like Jody's 13 and Mark is like 9 or 10. I don't know why. That's how it looks. So they're all, getting together, happy, as can be. But the Stanley guy is acting very strange and bizarre. And the grandparents look kind of worried, and the kids are like, what's up with that? So very early on in the story, Jody and Mark are talking with their grandparents at dinner time, and Stanley and his son Styx are there. Styx is like this older 16-year-old kid, like in the book. I don't know how old he is in the episode, but they're all talking about recent events, and Stanley seems to be kind of controlling the grandparents, and it's made more clear early on when there's a scene involving Styx in the cornfield, where you get the sense that Styx is like this prankster, right? And Stanley is, kind of upset with everyone, kind of short-tempered, and even Styx is kind of cowering to this. So the kids kind of file this in the back of their brain, but they also know that something has gone wrong with these scarecrows, right? And they learn pretty quickly that while messing around with these scarecrow stalks after playing catch, that they think that these scarecrows can move, right? And we see a montage while everybody's in bed of these scarecrows getting up, and you see one of them come to the window and iconically knock on the front door, signifying us to the audience that they are alive already. Well, Stanley drops the bombshell to Jody and Mark in the episode counterpart, not necessarily the book, that he has this superstition book and he's pretty much said the spell, made him come to life in the past, and has the power to do so. So he openly just kind of spoils what's been going on very early on in the episode. And the kids, throughout this story, they, I think it was Mark in the episode instead of Jody who discovered this, but Mark's looking outside one night and they notice that these scarecrows, these three scarecrows early on, one of them, or if not all three of them, are kind of twitching in the wind. And Jody's like, you know what, Mark, your imagination is, going wild. Well, in the book, it was actually Jody experiencing that. So I thought that was a weird change, right? So you have all this stuff kind of building on. And it all kind of coalesces one day after they all know this has been going on. Jody and Mark sees, like the book counterparts, their grandparents are kind of affected by this scarecrow phenomenon. The grandfather is kind of afraid to tell any scary stories. The grandmother doesn't make chocolate chip pancakes. There's a famous line where Mark says, chocolate chip pancakes, right? Instead, they get cornflakes, like the book, which is Stanley's favorite breakfast. And then that kind of, adds on later on where, the grandma wants to make dessert. Instead of making apple pie, she makes cherry pie because it's Stanley's favorite. And it builds up to where the kids kind of start resenting Stanley a little bit. And there's an event while they're playing hide and seek where a scarecrow jumps out in front of them. And it startles Mark and Jody, and Mark kind of injures his wrist. And Stanley kind of realizes that maybe some of these scarecrows aren't all the way dead. And Jody feels hard-pressed to kind of confront Styx because she thinks in the episode version here that Styx has been behind this and she's tired of dealing with it. So she heads out to nearby the guest house where Styx and Stanley live, checks out the barn, confronts Styx. And Styx like, hey, I don't know what you're talking about, but you got to get out of here. It's not wise that you stay here any longer, so it's going to end badly, essentially. So this kind of culminates into the final act of the story. And I'm trying to be very vague with this because I don't want to spoil it too much. But essentially, this conflict builds up with all these characters. The grandparents are kind of absent in the climax. So essentially, it's just Jody, Mark, Styx, and Stanley. Jody and Mark decide to confront Styx at the guest house, or I think it might be just Jody. And she has this close call with this scarecrow that comes to life, or may not comes to life, right? And Styx spills the beans about the motives of Stanley, and it's a little bit different from the book. In the book, Stanley kind of accidentally does this, and then, sees the benefits later of it. But in the episode, it seems like he did this on purpose to get some type of power out of it. And while they're going over all this, Stanley overhears the conversation and bolts out of the guest house. And, oh yeah, I realize what Mark is doing. Like the book, Jody has kind of wanted to get revenge on Styx a little bit, so she dresses Mark up like a scarecrow and puts him out in the field one night to scare Styx, but that's what led to the confrontation and the revelation and all that. Well, it ends up being that Stanley runs out into the middle of the cornfield, does something with a superstition book that's kind of dumb. And the climax involves pretty much the four of them dealing with these scarecrow creatures that may or may not have come to life inside of a farmhouse. And something happens to them. And then it seems all resolved, and we get the ending of the story where we find out, have things changed? Have things gotten for the better? And in typical twist fashion, something was left behind and something awaits these characters. So that's essentially the Scarecrow Walks at Midnight episode. Now, one thing I think I can start off as a positive is that this episode is a genuine alternate take on the Scarecrow Walks at Midnight story. This feels like, if you don't like the book version as much, this, I think, would be a good answer to you maybe liking the story. But for me, I can always appreciate something for it trying to be stand out and make it worthwhile to watch. And this episode definitely has enough differences to come back to for me. I think that the changes that were made with the Scarecrows in this made the Scarecrows front and center pretty early on in the story. And instead of doing like dream sequences and stuff like that, even though there is a dream sequence with Jodie and her grandparents, I didn't even mention that in the plot overview because it's kind of asinine to the whole overall story. It's more like shoehorned in there to just to pad out runtime and to include more things from the book. But yeah, I mean, these Scarecrow designs are very creepy, and they're pretty much nightmare inducing for me. Yeah, so hats off to the production department for making the Scarecrows scarier than what they were in my mind reading the book, which I think is an added bonus. I do like some changes here, especially with like Mark's character. I think he's less annoying than he was in the book, so I can always appreciate that. Jodie is a little more average in this episode, unfortunately. Like in the book, she's a little more, you know, emotionally driven. She has a lot more limelight there. So I feel like this is a downgrade for her, but it's not terrible or anything. She's quite serviceable. Styx had pretty good acting. His actor went on to play a character in Final Destination 3 years later, which I always get a kick out of when I watch this. So that's fun. And Stanley's actor, I think, is definitely the highlight of this episode. I think the actor played in a few episodes of Are You Afraid of the Dark? I remember he was in The Tale of the Fire Ghost. And this guy is very creepy. And Stanley's performance is quite, you know, unsettling in this episode. So I think the acting and the character changes were really good. And some aesthetics were pretty well done here with the Scarecrows. And that leads into the atmosphere. I think for what this episode was able to capture with its budget, it was very serviceable to the book's atmosphere. Maybe not as well done, but it definitely felt like a farmland with a cornfield and all of that. And yeah, it did what it needed to do. So I can't complain there. Another thing I liked was, I guess, in the back half of the story, there is a change here with like the motives of Stanley from the book also. And I don't like to constantly compare the book differences to the episodes in these episode reviews, but that's really why I like this episode compared to others. Because as is, the story is still mostly the same thing, just with different tweaks and everything. But I do enjoy the different motives of Stanley, making him more sinister than he was in the book. And I also do appreciate how tense the climax really was. Yeah, there's just something about it. It just captures a little more horror than your average Goosebumps episode was able to do in this old show. So it is definitely one of the scarier ones and one of the more tenser ones, in my opinion. And some of the comedy in this episode landed pretty well, whether it be intentional or unintentional. The chocolate chip pancakes line is an absolute golden line from the whole show. Stamp that, put it on a t-shirt. It's fantastic. Yeah. But that leads me into my negatives. While I love a lot about this episode, some of the changes kind of add up here for me. And I'll start off with probably the most noticeable one going into this, is how the pace is so streamlined in this thing. While I can definitely see some people liking this pace over something as a slow burn as the book was, my issue with this is that it goes from zigzag point to zigzag point, and there's more focus in the episode over Stanley and the grandparents' drama. As in the book, it was there, but it was also a mixture of this allergy paranoia going on with Jodie, which I should mention, the allergy bit of Jodie's character is completely erased from the episode for some reason. But that was kind of evenly there. And also with the whole thing with Styx possibly being this prankster with these scarecrows was also evenly mixed in the book. And here, like I said, it's more focused on the Stanley and grandparents drama, more so than building up, is Styx being this prankster, or is Jodie seeing these visions of things that aren't really real? And I feel like some of this stuff is shoehorned in there from the book to keep some type of tangibility. Like, certain things are fine. When you sit down and look at, the grandfather not being able to tell any more scary stories, that was in the book, that's fine. The grandma not making chocolate chip pancakes from the book, that's fine. There's some small changes with that, but it's still mostly the same. The cherry pie bit, right? But then you have the dream sequence with Jody and her grandparents being scarecrows. Why is that in there? Especially when Jody, the changes they made to Jody makes her more of the skeptic than Mark was in the book. So now Mark seems to be the one that believes what he sees with his own two eyes, and Jody's the skeptic, right? But she gets the dream. Why? Like I said, that feels shoehorned in from the book. Why is it there? Another thing that I think really does not make a lot of sense is the whole thing about dressing Mark up like a scarecrow, right? Jody has only seen Sticks, at least in the episode, take a stick and poke the legs of a scarecrow, right? She and Mark, well, at least Mark has seen these scarecrows move, and Jody's had these nightmarish visions. But she still thinks that Mark is the one throwing these scarecrows, so she goes out of her way after only seeing Mark only do this once with her own true eyes, and one other time where where a scarecrow just fell off the post and sprained Mark's wrist, to dress Mark up like a scarecrow. Why? Why is that in there? There's not that much believability with that, because you're cutting out a lot of the exposition in the back and the context to it all that was actually in the book. So here it just feels random. And that's kind of my overall issue with this episode in a nutshell, is that you have all these inserted things from the book and all these new things that don't quite match up all that well. So you have forced elements here, feels random, doesn't really fit what the overall story is trying to say. And it feels kind of uneven with its story build. It's not as a grand crescendo like the book was, in my opinion. It's just fast-paced randomness. Which leads me into the final act. While the final act, I love how tense the climax is and all that. And I think the change they made here makes the book's climax resolution, vindicated a little bit. I think the book's climax resolution was very convenient, as in here, it was all sudden in the moment type of stuff, and it made a lot of sense. However, leading into the twist ending, I feel like it's kind of playing on the book's twist, but in a different way, and it's just, what's going on with that? And then I don't even want to spoil what it involves, because it'll definitely give away with what happens in the climax, but all I have to say is not a fan of that. And I think it actually goes into a bad twist area, because it involves Stanley doing something really dumb. And that's all I'll say. Even though I do feel like you do get a sense of where the characters have gone in the span of time, more so than in the book, because the book had like a page, maybe page and a half actual ending worth of content. This does at least show, while it's on screen, some point of moving on and all, kind of healing from what just happened. So I do think in some aspects the ending is better, but I think the twist is not handled the best. And it's kind of silly and goofy for the sake of being silly and goofy. So all in all, the Scarecrow Walks at Midnight. What do I think about this episode? I think it's at least a B tier episode. And I struggled where I wanted to put this, because initially, with that whole randomness factor going on with the episode, and I think, the botched twist at the end, it kind of got to me a little bit. And I wanted to give this like a 4.1 out of 5 stars. But then after thinking about it, and thinking about, what this episode was doing and on its own, I think this is a quite scary episode for the show. And honestly, I'd probably give this like a 4.3 out of 5 stars, the same grade I gave the book. And here's why. I do think that for a truncated, expedited version of the book counterpart, this does the story pretty much the same way, just with different tweaks in there. Some tweaks worked magnificently, some did not. But it has so many iconic moments, and the actors are all good here. There's no bad acting here. It has some of the best atmosphere the show is able to bring. So I have to give it some bonus points just for it being a standout episode, in my opinion, in a lot of regards. So, yeah. So I only deducted zero point 0.7 off for those issues. I settled on a 4.3 out of 5, which is a solid B or a high B plus territory of a grade. And I think I'm being perfectly fair with that. I know some people would definitely put this in the A tier or possibly even S tier episodes. I totally get it. But I just have some issues with it, and I think I'm being perfectly fair. So, that's my thoughts on the Scarecrow Walks at Midnight episode. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this episode before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.